Focus on this story about controversy that still surrounds South Africa and the rest of Africa's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, 51% of African countries have voted in favor of the United Nations motion for Russia to end its military operation in Ukraine. 2% voted against and 31% are said to have abstained. Now, that includes South Africa. So could this seemingly divided stand by African countries have an impact on intra-Africa relations should the war continue long term? And what about the rest of the world? Daniel Silke is a political economy analyst and is joining us now to discuss this. Daniel, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Just a broad question first. What do you make of how various African countries, including South Africa, have voted in the UN last week?
Thanks for having me. Look, clearly there are differing interests for the various African countries. Some have some greater exposure to trade with Russia. Others have greater exposure to security cooperation agreements with Russia, particularly those African countries that are somewhat more authoritarian. They've been increasingly relying upon Russian assistance to prop up various regimes across the continent. And others, as in the case of South Africa, certainly have historic links, perhaps even the Mozambique and Angolas of this world, historic links, of course, to the liberation struggle days and the role that Russia and the old Soviet bloc played in assisting the liberation movements. So each country has got their own specific interests, and we've seen those interests really play out in quite dramatic fashion in this particular vote at the UN General Assembly. And I do think that the issue of Russia is going to become a divisive factor for African governments should this protracted crisis continue. Yeah,
Daniel, before we carry on, I mean, we saw your tweet where you attached a picture, an infographic showing in yellow and green and black and red what the patterns were, and the legend is very clear. I mean, you see quite a mix of yellow being those who abstained, and then a bit of red. There's only one red that voted against. And then you see those who voted in favor in green. And you look at that, you can just see the divide there, how it was. So there are various reasons. But, I mean, you mentioned a country like Mozambique as an example that has historic relations as a country, you know, going before to 1975 when Frelimo was still fighting the liberation war against Portuguese colonialism, right up to after independence, even beyond the Soviet Union days of 1990. They abstained. So what's the value in abstaining?
Well, I think some countries want to play it both sides if they can, have a somewhat two-faced reaction to this. I would include South Africa in this. Abstaining, of course, ultimately is tantamount to supporting the Russian action in the Ukraine. And I think what we are going to see is that if this conflict continues and if it redraws the geopolitical map of the world, we are likely to see more and more countries face global questioning about where they stand on this issue. This can affect trade patterns. It can affect investment into countries across the world, and it can redraft and redraw many of the international rules of the game. So I think African countries that have abstained will be looked upon certainly by the West with a degree of trepidation. It muddies the water effectively when it comes to those abstaining countries and their relations with the West as well. We've seen that already creep in to diplomatic language with South Africa, and I think this is going to continue to be a nasty side effect. The fact that these countries have abstained and are not willing ultimately to support the broader resolution.
If, as you say, we're already seeing that nasty side effect playing itself out in so far as how the rest of Europe and part of the West, like America, are looking at countries like South Africa and others who abstained, what about inside our continent? For example, would countries like Nigeria, Egypt, Ghana, who all voted in favor, be looking at the likes of us in South Africa and Algeria, who abstained, and Mozambique and the rest, and say, oh, okay, hold on. Why did you guys abstain? Why did you, as our African brothers and sisters, abstain? Will that cause intra-continental tensions?
Well, I think that, you know, foreign policy issues is always awkward for countries to reach any agreement on. We want trade and we want to expand trade across this continent. There is a respect for each and individual country's foreign policy positions. But ultimately, if this crisis becomes really a global crisis, if it's a second Cold War, if containment is again the focus of global politics as it was during the first Cold War, then I think it can begin to pit nations against one another. And nations can seek investment from certain blocs in the world. Others will seek investment from other blocs in the world, as we had during the old Soviet Union days. So there is a danger here. But increasingly, I might add, Dan, I think that the African Union itself has been divided on a variety of international relations issues. Even the issue of Israel's observer status at the African Union has been a bone of contention for South Africa versus many others. So increasingly, polarization of international affairs and geopolitical tensions will create tensions even within the family of African nations.
Now, should this war continue, as you said, long term, in months and maybe into next year, hopefully not, what kind of impact, knowing this background, this context you've just painted for us, could it have on intra-Africa relations going forward, even though the AU has not before agreed on issues and found commonalities, but to take the world back to the old what was it called, beyond the Iron Curtain type of world, where you had a Cold War between the East and the West, and many of African countries were caught either one or the other side. This one, the Russia-Ukraine war, long-term wise, intra-Africa relations, is it going to be bad?
I think trade is still going to be the predominant feature, and I think African brotherhood is still much more important. But I think the issue will be really for Russia. If Russia is to be isolated extensively in future, will she use her improved relations with some African countries in order to circumnavigate many of these sanctions that exist? And I think if Russia is to look to shore up her supply chains via some African countries who are more sympathetic to her, that could put strain on the broader African Union.
Yeah. Now, just a final question. I saw a headline over the weekend, Daniel, saying EU and America and others in the West are putting pressure on South Africa to state a very clear position on this. And the president, in his weekly newsletter, basically saying they want the United Nations to promote dialogue. South Africa is for dialogue, and that's why they abstain. They believe that's the role of the United Nations. Is that a clear enough position?
No, it's not a clear position. It's a muddying of the waters position. It shows a two-faced response, and it does show also within the ANC, and we saw that in terms of the variety of contradictory statements coming out of the ANC, that there is contestation on this issue, just as there's contestation on all sorts of domestic policy issues within the ANC. Increasingly, there's contestation within the party on foreign policy issues, and there couldn't be a bigger one than this one before us.
Okay, thank you very much for your insights as usual. Daniel Silke, a political economy analyst, here with us on Today on eNCA. And